Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Missing Link in Reading Comprehension webinar. It is 3 o'clock now. I'm going to give everyone just about one more minute to sign in, and then we will get started. So just hang tight. And hello, see some folks are saying hi from the chat. Thank you all. It's really great to be here. We'll get started in about 30 more seconds. All right. So I am going to pop my screen on here just for a moment to say hello and to introduce myself. I am Ann Lucas. I don't know about all of you, but I have been living in a faceless digital world for the past week or so. And so I find it really nice to just see the faces of the people that I'm talking to. So wanted to just come on and introduce myself to all of you. And I want to start just by saying thank you. Thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with us. These are really unprecedented and kind of unsettling times right now. And it means a lot to me to have you all here. And I also know that teachers and educators in schools right now are in a near impossible and highly stressful situation, with many of you likely away from your students, with trying to figure out what remote learning is, how this is going to work long term, and not knowing when you're going to be back in your schools and when you're going to be back with your students, and wanting to make sure that they're still making progress even though you're not with them all the time. And at Amplify here, we're committed to supporting you and to all teachers across the country during this difficult time. And so as a result, I just wanted to be transparent that I changed the nature of this webinar just ever so slightly, given kind of the current climate of where we are. Originally, this was very heavily focused on classroom activities and things that you could do with your students live. But given that that's not going to be possible for many of you at this point for an unknowable amount of time, we are going to be focusing a bit on how you can practice some of these things digitally, and specifically how our Amplify Reading digital program will help you practice some of the skills, will help your students practice some of the skills that we're going to talk about today. And we're excited to share that we will be offering our program to schools across the country for free for the remainder of the school year, to support all of you in trying to figure out how to do this whole remote learning thing and to help make sure your students are still making progress, even though you're not with them every day. So stay tuned. At the end of the webinar, we'll be giving some more information on that. And I will pop off video now so you don't have to watch me this whole time. But again, just wanted to say hello and thank you. And so with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Would love to, I know you all saw my face. I don't think we're going to be able to see each other's faces, but let's start by just getting to know who's here. I see there's lots of chats coming in with folks introducing themselves, but just take a moment to complete this poll. What do you currently teach at your school? It should be popping up on your screens momentarily. I see lots of stuff coming in through the chat. Oh, there it is. All right, so looks like we've got some second and third grade teachers, some intervention RTI specialists, literacy coaches, and then other. I'm just combing through the chat really briefly. There's a lot of answers coming in, so trying to read them. Some principals, assistant principals, curriculum specialists. Awesome. So great to have you all here. We've got a wide variety of folks. This is wonderful. Whoops. There we go. So our agenda for today, we are going to be starting just by taking a look at the many different components of reading comprehension and just how complex it really is. And then we'll shift gears into talking about this missing link. What are these particular reading comprehension skills that we haven't been focusing on as much in our comprehension instruction, but that do play a really critical role in overall reading comprehension success? We'll then talk a little bit about instruction and classroom resources. And as I mentioned, I'll be showing some digital examples about how this works in our Amplify reading program as well, if that's something that you're interested in. Talk a little bit about efficacy results that we've seen so far. And then I'm hoping at the end that we'll have some time for questions. There is also a Q&A function here. So if I think a lot of folks are familiar with the chat, it looks like. If you want to ask questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to do them in that Q&A. We have some moderators who are going to be keeping track of those and will help me collect all of them so that at the very end of the webinar, I can answer those for you. So with that, let's talk a little bit about why reading comprehension is so complex and what are all of the different pieces of it. Take a moment to just think about the following question to yourself. What is the most difficult thing about teaching reading comprehension? You can feel free to post your thoughts in the chat function or just think about them quietly to yourself. Oh yeah, I'm seeing like students think they just need to read the words, not just understand the text. Striking the balance between decoding work and comprehension, definitely. Ooh, there's really good ones. They're going so fast, I can't read them all. Having to consistently apply strategies, how to meet all of the different needs of students. Ooh, I feel that one for sure. Hard to gauge students' comprehension. When you have 27 in a class, it's really hard to identify where it fails. Yeah, I think that's a great one. So much of it occurs non-verbally. That's also a really good one. Really awesome ones. Encourage you to read through that chat. I think all of those really resonate with me as well. I know particularly that one that was talking about how, and there were a couple others that were popping up in there, how it's really difficult to know with comprehension exactly what a student is struggling with. It's something that happens, we can't really see what they're thinking, and we can ask them to explain it, but so often the students that struggle with reading comprehension will also have a hard time maybe articulating what they're thinking about. And so for us as teachers, it's really hard to figure out, like, what's the one thing that I can do to help the student with their comprehension? Where might they be struggling? And the reason for that is because learning to read, and particularly learning to read in English more so than any other language, is incredibly complex. And so this is a model that some of you might be familiar with. It's called the Scarborough Braid. And this encompasses many of the different critical skills that we teach every day in reading, and that students have to learn to do automatically. And that they must, not only be able to do each of these in isolation, but then eventually wrap them all together into one in order to achieve this overall goal of reading comprehension. All the way down, as was being mentioned in there, balancing the decoding, the letter sound knowledge, the fluency, with more of these, comprehension pieces, understanding vocabulary, monitoring their own comprehension, text structure. All of these pieces are important and they have to do it all simultaneously. So it's not only hard to think about what they're thinking, but it's also just hard to do because there's so many different processes that are going on at once. And so today I want to take what is already this kind of complex structure, and I want to unpack it one step further and illuminate one more piece to this puzzle that poses a challenge for students. And so I want to bring up a scenario that I know is really familiar for me as a teacher. And I hope that many of you are familiar with something like this as well. Imagine that you have a student and the student, you want to see how the student is doing with their reading comprehension. So you select a passage for them, something like the one you see on your screen, that you know the student is able to decode. You know that they can they can decode all of these words, they'll be able to read it fluently. You know the vocabulary is right at their level. So you kind of feel like you've removed all of those challenging barriers for the student so that they can focus exclusively on their comprehension. So you give the student the passage, student reads the passage beautifully, and then you say, okay, we're ready. Let's see how the student comprehended. Should have been great, right? Because they were able to read it and we know that the vocabulary was there. So you ask them a seemingly simple comprehension question. Why did Carla get wet on the walk to school? But then the student responds with something like this. And then you as the teacher are sort of left just thinking, what just happened? I chose this passage specifically because I knew they'd be able to read it. I've taught me an idea, I've done all of the things I'm supposed to do, but clearly something is still just not clicking. And as many of you mentioned, it's so hard to figure out what is that thing? Like, where did you come to, did we read the same passage? How did you come to this conclusion when it's seemingly so simple? And I know that this is something that happened to me frequently when I was a teacher. And so let's take a closer look at how something that is seemingly so simple is actually fairly complex, and how there may be more skills at play than what we previously thought. So in just a moment, I'm going to put a sentence up on the screen that we can read together. After you read, either on a piece of paper or just in your mind or something, draw a picture or a diagram or something that summarizes what we just read. So here's our sentence. Carla forgot her umbrella, so she got very wet on the walk to school. Just take a moment, either draw something to yourself, think something to yourself, draw something on a piece of paper. Just something to summarize this sentence for yourself. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to think about that and hopefully you have something there now. So now we have a poll. Which of these things did you have in your picture? You can select all but apply. Oops. All right, so we've got a lot of folks that had an image of a young girl, lots of folks who had a rain cloud, some kind of puddles, some kind of indication that Carla did not have an umbrella. Not as many people who had a school, maybe because she was on her way, so that also makes sense. But a lot of really similar stuff. And if we were doing this live at this point, I'd ask you to share your picture with your partner. And so I have a couple examples of when I've done this live with folks, and these are some of the pictures that we see. And it becomes pretty clear how even though the pictures can look a little bit different, in a lot of ways, they're really similar, just like we saw with our poll. You probably had one character, something to show Carla. She probably wasn't happy. There's maybe a rain cloud or some type of rain falling, no umbrella in sight. And then maybe you drew a school. You can see not everyone drew that in these pictures either, but just something kind of showing that she's, doesn't have an umbrella and is not happy about getting wet. And so we all had in our pictures that it was raining, but how did we know it was raining? When we go back to read this sentence, it doesn't actually say Carla forgot her umbrella and it was raining, but there's clues in the sentence that help us figure that out. And the clue is that it says Carla forgot her umbrella. And so you as a reader now have to make a little mini inference there, that if you are forgetting your umbrella, it probably means that it's raining. And so that's something it doesn't actually explicitly say in the sentence, but all of us as fluent readers were able to make that small inference, and we're able to have that common picture in our minds, that common model in our minds of what was going on here. And then when we think about why did Carla get wet on the walk to school, the sentence also doesn't say Carla forgot her umbrella and that's the reason she got wet on the walk to school. Instead, it just has this one word, so. And just that one word alone is the indicator for us as readers that there's a cause and effect relationship between Carla forgetting her umbrella and getting wet on the walk to school. So there are, now all of a sudden we have this picture in our minds that she doesn't have her umbrella and it's raining and that's why she's getting wet on the walk to school. And so at Amplify, we dug into the research on this and discovered that there's actually a lot going on beyond just decoding while we read. So to some of those comments that were coming up in the chat about how, there's not always a balance between decoding and comprehension, or how students just think that all they have to do is decode. That's the research is showing that that's not actually the case. There's a lot going on. And as fluent readers, like all of us who are here, we have no idea the amount of work that we're actually doing because it's so automatic for us. And so all of these things, we use, like I was just giving the example of making those many inferences, or just being able to connect cause and effect really easily at a sentence level even. We use all of that to build a picture or a model in our minds of what's happening in a text as we read it. And so often, I hear teachers saying things like, we tell students to picture something or visualize something in their mind, something that's really automatic for all of us as fluent readers. But then imagine a student isn't able to do that while they read, and their mental model is now all of a sudden broken and they're not comprehending the text, even though they can decode it. They might not be able to make that inference that it's raining, or they might have just skated right by it because they were just focused on decoding. So then when you ask them that question, why does Carla get wet? They'll fill that gap with something else that would just make sense to them based on their background knowledge, something like the student in the example I gave previously, something like a water bottle. And so now all of a sudden, these little small moments are affecting their overall comprehension of what seemed to be a really simple passage. And so we know that there are many facets of teaching reading, but we often don't think about the process or what students do while they read. We think of that as being the phonics or the decoding or the fluency, while the product or what students do after they read is the comprehension. When in fact, the research that we looked at and the example we just saw shows that that process of comprehension is often overlooked and can be a really critical piece to this ultimate goal of reading comprehension. And that's the missing link, these comprehension processes, or the ways in which students build this picture or this model or this network of ideas in their mind based on these really small sentence level ideas. And that is critically important to their overall reading comprehension. So what are these skills? What are these comprehension processes? And what do we do about it now that we know it's something that's automatic for us, but maybe not for all of our students? So at Amplify, we work to identify 6 of these comprehension processes that are critical to building a mental model. And the research that we were looking at here showed that there were many of these skills, maybe even as many as 17 of them, but we were really combing through the literature here to focus on the skills where there was clear evidence that when the skill was practiced in isolation, it improved overall comprehension. And we narrowed it down to these 6: morphology, NEFRA, syntactic awareness, connectives, gap-filling, inference, and monitoring meaning. For the sake of time today, we are going to focus on just 3 of these. We'll focus on NEFRA, connectives, and gap-filling inferences. But I believe at the end of this, you will be receiving some resources to complement this, which will have some more information on these other 3 that we aren't able to get to today. So let's dive in by looking at gap-filling inference. What is this? Let's start with an example. If we look at this sentence here, Boris wanted to join his friends, but he didn't bring his bathing suit. And I might ask you something like, where are Boris and his friends? The text doesn't actually say where they are, but there's a clue: bathing suit. This word bathing suit, much like the word umbrella in the example about Carla, gives us a clue about where Boris and his friends might be. And so if you were to just think to yourself, where do you think they might be? And feel free to just post in the chat some of your ideas that you have. The beach, the pool, the swimming pool, the lake, beach, pool, lake, ooh, fire hydrant. I like that one. Okay, so I'm hearing all things that have to do with water, because all of you are probably thinking, like, where might you need a bathing suit? You're not going to need a bathing suit if you are at, the amusement park with friends. You're not going to need a bathing suit if you are at a museum. So we know that they're going to have to be somewhere where there's water and where they're potentially getting wet and having fun in the water. So it might be a beach, could be a pool. All of those, I think, would make sense in the context of this sentence. And that's the idea of gap-filling inference. This idea that writers often make assumptions about what can be left unstated. They do this for many reasons. Sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it, and mostly it's just so that the writing remains interesting, right? Like when you think about the books that all of us read, it doesn't always spell everything out. So we have to be aware of when we have to fill these different gaps. And so the gap-filling inferences allow readers to use their background knowledge to fill in any discrepancies or gaps that the author leaves out. Good readers do this relatively seamlessly, while struggling readers will have difficulty knowing when they need to fill in the gaps. Or alternately, they may fill in the gaps with their own background knowledge when they shouldn't. And I think it's important to pause here and take note about the importance that background knowledge plays in this type of skill. And that's something that's not the focus of this particular webinar, but something we at Amplify value very deeply, and have many resources on our website that we'd be happy to direct you to share more about the importance of background knowledge and how to build that with your students. But just wanted to kind of call that out here, that I think that is a critical piece here. So how would you actually approach this with students? The research suggests explicitly practicing this with students with an exercise similar to this, starting with simple sentences like the ones I just gave you, asking students to identify what's the information that's left out. So for this particular example, the information that's left out is where they are. We don't know where they are or what they're doing. That's what's not stated. So that's what we have to fill in. And so asking students that question and discussing what inferences can be made so that the sentence still makes sense. Essentially what I just did with all of you. So something like the lake, the pool, playing in the fire hydrant, all of those would make sense. And it's important in these types of conversations when you are all back and live with your students to try some out that don't make sense. So students can start to become aware of that lacking coherence, like how it wouldn't make sense to say that they're at a museum or they're at the movie theater, because then why Boris should be able to join, because you don't need a bathing suit at those places. And this is something that we've seen in the research you can do as early as kindergarten. If you're reading the sentence out loud to students and they're helping you build this picture, it's something students even as young as 5 years old can kind of start to do and start to think about. So here are a couple more examples that I'll share with you just to give you another idea of how this works. The animals escaped from their cages and terrified the guests. You might prompt students with something like, what clues does the author give us about where they might be? Or where might you have animals in cages? Kind of prompting them with these questions about those clues that are left behind in that sentence. And most students in that instance would then be able to think, okay, well, they're at the zoo. Because I've actually heard some kids say circus, which would also make sense because sometimes at the circus, there are animals in cages. Here's another one. Jordan had so much fun playing fetch in the park with Buster. So again, you can start just by asking something like, what's missing? What information is missing? You can have students build this picture along with you using what's explicitly in that sentence and then realize what's missing. What clues does the author give about who Buster might be? Want to flag again to my earlier note about background knowledge. I think this is an example that would require some background knowledge. So and vocabulary as well around the word fetch. So you may need to preview some of that with students before, if you know you have students that would struggle with that, which is fine. You're not giving anything away because they're still doing that work of figuring out what's missing. And then most students here would then say, oh, okay, well, if you usually play fetch with a dog, that must be what Jordan is doing in the park. And I love these examples because, similarly, when we were looking at the mental model examples, visualization is something that we often do with our students, and we know it's important, but this is such a really focused use of it. I know for me, when I was a teacher, I would just generally say to kids, visualize, picture in your mind, just do visualization. Which is not always helpful for a struggling reader. So the more students kind of have this purposeful type of activity where they can really figure out what's missing, the more automatic it becomes for them. And the more they just start to do it naturally the way all of us on this call do. Whoops. All right. So here's an example of what this looks like in our Amplify reading program. So this has the added ability of some distractor options. So remember how I was saying how that conversation about what makes sense and what doesn't make sense is important to have with students, and that can be hard to do online, having those types of conversations. So this gives that same ability. There's some distractor options here that might make sense, but don't necessarily fill in the gap appropriately. So you might think, a student might think, oh, Boris needs a bathing suit. So I'll give him, I'll choose the one of the bathing suit because that's what he needs. But that's not necessarily what's left out. So kind of talking through that, or again, the amusement park. That might be somewhere that you go with your friends, but that's not what the clues in the sentence are leading us towards. So some really powerful ways where you can achieve the same type of skill practice, but in a digital format. All right, I will pause there. Again, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the chat so we can gather those up, and I will be happy to answer any at the end. Let's move on to talk about the second comprehension process here, connectives. So here's another example of these connective words. Here are two sentences about Sally. Sally was thirsty, so she drank some water. Sally ate a cookie after she ate a hot dog. So now if I were to ask two questions, why did Sally drink water? And when did she eat a cookie? Go ahead and just put on in the chat there your answers to those questions. I'm seeing because she was thirsty, right. So she got the water because she was thirsty. And when did she eat it? After she ate the hot dog. Okay, thank you. It's nice to see that those responses that you all are with me here. So exactly, you were all able to really quickly answer those questions. But what words in these sentences gave us those answers? It was just one small word in each sentence, 2 words total. The words so and the words after. These are such small words that most of us in this webinar probably don't even think about because they're so natural and they're so automatic for us. And these types of words that are just typically not part of our reading comprehension instruction. But similar to the example we looked at with Carla, imagine if you didn't know what this word after meant. And then someone asked you when Sally ate a hot dog. That small word can make all the difference in what you understand from the seemingly simple sentence. And if there are anyone, I know we had some ELL specialists who were in the webinar. I'm sure this probably resonates with you. I hear that a lot from folks who work with students for whom English is not their first language, because a lot of times these words don't totally translate into other languages and they don't exist in other languages. So students are truly just baffled at what these mean when they come across them. And so asking that really simple question to us as fluent readers, we're like, how can you not get that? But to them, it doesn't make sense. So these are the types of words that we call connectives. They're also sometimes called marker words. But the purpose of them in the English language is that they signal a relationship between 2 pieces of information. So they're essential in kind of helping you understand information within and across sentences. And they give insight into how different types of information is related. So there are 4 different categories of these. We have additive, temporal, causal, and contrastive. So if we were looking at, for example, the additive, when you see an additive connective word between 2 sentences, that is giving you a clue that those 2 pieces of information go together, as opposed to something that is contrastive, which is telling you that they are different, or they're not, they're not related in some way. Versus causal, which is the example that we looked at in Carla, signaling that there's a cause and effect relationship between those 2 pieces of information. So each of these words serves a really important purpose in writing and in reading. And so in terms of connectives instruction, sentence combining instruction had the strongest impact on reading comprehension outcomes. It increased students' ability to produce complex sentences themselves, as well as increased their syntactic awareness overall so that they could start to understand more complex syntax within a text. And so this can be done in a variety of different ways. I'll give you again some examples of how you might do it with students when you're back in your classrooms live, and then I'll show you some digital examples. So I think beginning with direct instruction, with just the context, with the words within each category. So starting by saying, okay, these are all additive words, and that means, that they tell us these 2 things go together. And kind of going through each of these categories, you can do this by teaching in context, just drawing attention to connectives in really simple sentences, like when you're reading aloud a text or something like that. You can talk about the meaning of the word in the context of the sentence. And you can even manipulate it. So, when you change and with but, how does that change the meaning of the sentence? And just helping students start to see these words and become more aware of them in everyday text. I want to make a note here that contrastive words tend to be the most difficult for students, particularly the English language learners and the beginning and the struggling readers as well. And then once students understand the meaning of those words, they can start with instruction on sentence combining. So here's an example of 2 sentences. The girl scraped her knee, she fell off her bike. And you might instruct students to say something like, combine these 2 sentences and use the word because. You can see now all of a sudden in this sentence combining activity, the importance that syntax plays. A lot of times I've even seen this done as like grammar instruction. And the student has to decide like where where within this sentence or where within these two sentences would that make sense? And figure out that it would be, you know, the girl scraped her knee because she fell off her bike. And then once students become familiar with that syntax, or like where commonly these words tend to belong, then you can start to go one step further and ask them which connective makes the most sense. So here you're giving them the location of the word, but they have to decide the one that would still make the sentence make sense. So you can practice this with one category of connective words or multiple, depending on the student's level. But here's an example of Evelyn cleared the table, and you would have to decide, is it after, but, or so? Everyone was finished with dinner. And again, I think, you know, when you are back live with your students, discussing how these different words might make sense and how they change the meaning of the sentence as well is a really great activity that you can do. And then once students are, you know, familiar with the location and they're really comfortable with the different types of connectives, you can start to go one step further and just have students, give students two sentences, and they get to choose a word and they get to combine the two sentences. So they might say something like this: the boy fell over the chair because the chair was broken. But then as students become more familiar with these different words, what you will likely see, and what was seen in the research, is students just become more flexible with them. And they start to come up with sentences like this: because the chair was broken, the boy fell. Now all of a sudden we're manipulating the syntax of the sentence so that it's a little bit more complex. Or they might say something like where you don't even need a connective word: the boy fell over the broken chair. And all three of those sentences are saying the same thing, and they all make sense, but they're just saying it in a really different way, which is a really powerful moment for students to realize that. And then I just wanted to share one more example from the research, and you can do this as well when you're back with your students, that you know, you can start to just provide more naturalistic exercises like the one we just looked at. So give them 4 sentences that are all relatively connected in some way and similar. The apple fell, the apple was green, it fell from the branch, it did not hit anyone. I like to say things with students like, imagine you were reading that as a book. Would you want to continue reading that book? And every student is like, no, it's really boring. So what are some different ways that we can say all of the same things using connective words? And you'll start to see that students will be able to come up with many different possibilities. The green apple did not hit anyone when it fell from the branch. The green apple fell from the branch, but it did not hit anyone. And then even something like this: falling from the branch, the green apple did not hit anyone. So you can see how, like, I think this study is so powerful every time I look at it, because it shows how just this one simple exercise, practicing these words and practicing sentence combining in different ways, and how that actually allows, it sort of opens up this new world of syntax and you know, sentence understanding for students. And particularly as we're giving students more and more complex texts to read, it's even more important for them to be able to manipulate and to understand the syntax of different sentences. So I love this as another example of something where you just get so much bang from your buck with one activity that will take your students a really long way and will significantly help their overall reading comprehension. And so here's an example of, again, some of the sentence combining activities that we have in Amplify Reading. We have a game that's called Connect It, which will be this exact multiple choice type of activity. So this is something where you, we give you the location of the word and the student has to choose which word would make sense. Something that's not depicted here but also happens in this game is if the student starts to get some of these wrong, we do also provide direct instruction on, you know, this is what these word means, and this is what this word means, and this is when you would use it, and give them some additional practice with particular words before bringing them back to this exercise. So lots they can do here to help practice the skill. All right. I will pause there for a moment. Again, feel free to, I see lots of chats and Q&As coming through. Like I said, we have the moderators who are keeping track of all of that and will pass all of that along to me at the end. So I will move on to our third comprehension process that we will talk about today, which is a NEFRA. So I'll read this passage for us. Astronauts wear jetpacks to stay safe in space. Astronauts wear them like backpacks. Each pack has a jet thruster. Gas shoots from the thruster and moves the astronaut around. Something we can all read and understand. And now, if I were to ask you in the first paragraph, what is them referring to? So go ahead and just mark in the chat. What is them referring to? Jetpacks. Okay. Overwhelmingly, I see lots of responses coming in for jetpacks. Thank you. Exactly. It's referring to jetpacks. And so now imagine if you hadn't made that connection and you thought perhaps that it was referring to the astronauts. And you as a student read that sentence as astronauts wear astronauts like backpacks. Now all of a sudden you have a very different mental model in your mind. And if your teacher were to ask you a comprehension question about what a jetpack is, you might be very confused. And it's all because of that word them is substituted for the word jetpacks. Here's another example, and to better understand sort of why this can be really challenging. David lent his car to Olivia because she had missed the last train. If I were to ask you, who is she referring to? I'm sure almost overwhelmingly I would hear from all of you, it's Olivia. Yes, I see it in the chat. Pretty straightforward for us because there's only one she in this sentence, and that's Olivia. Feels fairly straightforward. But now, if I were to show you this sentence, David lent his car to Peter because he had missed the train. Who is he referring to? Now, all of us are fluent readers, so I see lots are coming in saying Peter, which is correct. But think about what that process felt like for you. And I know for me, when I do this type of activity, I often have to pause for a minute and be like, wait, who is he? There are two he's here. There's David and there's Peter. So which one is it talking about? It's a little bit more challenging. And again, it's almost like a little mini inference that you have to make here. It's not as automatic as when it was Olivia and it was that pronoun she. You have to kind of think like, well, it wouldn't make sense for David to lend his car to himself. So you have to sort of do a little bit more thinking with this example than you do with the previous one. And so that's really what the idea behind a NEFRA is. A NEFRA is a very fancy researcher term that essentially is talking about pronoun and antecedent relationships or noun substitutions. It's, again, something that fluent readers are able to resolve almost automatically. We barely even have to think about it. And it's a critical component to reading comprehension. You can see just in those two examples that we looked at, such a small misunderstanding can completely change the model that you're building in your mind. And so what's particularly challenging about resolving these anaphoric relationships is that, as I mentioned, it's essentially a mini inference in a lot of ways. You have to kind of think about what would make sense. And so if it's not something that's automatic for you yet, it's something you have to actually pause and think about and make sure that it coheres across a text. And the more you practice this individual skill, particularly when we think about our struggling readers, the more it becomes automatic for you. And then the more your overall reading comprehension improves. So to instruct on this, often the research will suggest to begin with explicit instruction on how authors use pronouns as shortcuts. And there's a little snippet that I took here from some of the research that we looked at. And upon seeing this, you might think like, oh, well, this is just grammar instruction. Pronouns are grammar. But this type of instruction is not about the kill and drill of the words themselves and what those words mean, but rather it's about that interpretation of language. That example that I gave with David and Peter in the car. It's about that interpretation of like what would make sense here and what doesn't make sense here, and having that thought process. So then once you sort of have that conversation with your students about, that these words exist and this is why they exist, you can use a script similar to this one and ask students to start to identify the relationships between pronouns and nouns and their antecedents independently. So asking them to circle any pronouns they see and draw a line back to the word that each pronoun is replacing. Ask them to think about how that story would sound without the pronoun. And then, again, once your students are back in your classrooms with you, you can ask them to compare their work with a partner. Did you find the same pronouns? Did you agree? What was tricky about it? You can scaffold this for students by having the anaphoric references already pre-underlined or pre-highlighted. So all they have to do is draw the line. Or you can stretch this for some students by asking them to replace the nouns and pronouns with others that would also make sense, sort of like Mad Lib style, which some students love doing that. And then here's an example of what this looks like in Amplify reading. So again, this is a game that we have called Unmask That, where students are trying to collect masks in order to solve a puzzle at the end. And to do that, they have to unmask the noun that the pronoun is substituting. So you can see a couple examples here. We scaffold it a little bit initially where we have the pronoun already highlighted for students, and they have to click the word that pronoun is replacing. So they do this for a variety of different exercises, and then at the end they get to complete a Mad Lib style activity to kind of put it all together. And similarly with this one, we do also have instruction similar to what that research is that I showed you, where if students get an incorrect answer and say with some of these examples, if they're thinking the he referred to being first child, or if the he refers to the tooth fairy or something different, then we will sort of offer this practice and instruction moment for them here about how these words do replace other nouns, and give them some additional sort of smaller sentence practice before they come back to this activity. All right, and so when we look at all of this, as I mentioned, we combed through a lot of literature to get a sense of like, what is the research showing and does this work? And then we at Amplify wanted to answer the same question. Does this actually work? And does this actually improve comprehension, something that is so hard for us as teachers to do and to teach? Does it work? And I wanted to share some of the initial data that we found that just providing instruction that is grounded in the science of reading is working, and providing students with these key domains of literacy, including these comprehension processes as a part of their instruction, is really impacting their overall reading scores. So you can see just a couple different examples here where we had 12% fewer students who were using Amplify reading were categorized at risk at the end of the year. 50% of students who were using Amplify reading made above typical grade progress. And then this last one as well, for anyone who works with a lot of English language learners, we saw a 35% reduction in the performance gap between English learners and non-English learners, and the students who were using Amplify reading compared with those who were not. So I think to us, this was really, it showed us that there was some really critical skills that we were not always including as part of our comprehension instruction. And it just sort of highlighted to us the importance of these comprehension processes as part of your overall reading instruction, and including it in that way. So with that, I will pause here for a moment, and I know that there are likely some questions that are coming in. So I will see what questions we have. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to read these off, and And let's see. Okay, so the first question, there were a lot that came in, so we're gonna try to answer as many of these as we can. So the first question is about gap filling inference. How many wrong assumptions should the teacher use? I'm concerned that my struggling readers, especially those with IEPs, might get sidetracked with the wrong answers. That is a great point. And absolutely something that if you do not feel like that would be a good use of time, or you feel like it would be more of a distraction than it would be worth, just do one or two so that they get this, they can see that it doesn't make sense, and why it doesn't make sense, and then move right on. I totally hear that sometimes kids will go down a path of thinking like, oh, but it would be funny if we thought they were at, some random place, or I don't know. So I totally hear that. And I think if you don't think that would be the right exercise for your students, you can feel free to just focus on the things that they should, the things that would make sense instead of the things that would not. The second question that came in terms of connectives, would you consider the examples you showed as exhaustive, or are there others? That's a great question. I will say the list I showed you is just what we found in the research. I would say there's definitely more than those. I don't have any explicit examples to share, but I would imagine there are plenty more words that could be added to that list. I just included the ones that we found in the research. So that's a great question. Question 3 is about NEFRA. What is the target age group that these lessons are geared to? Great question. So I know I mentioned for gap filling inference, you could do that with students as young as kindergarten if you're reading it to them. For connectives and for NEFRA, I would say you want to start that when students are already able to read. So you wouldn't want to do those activities with kindergarten. I would say probably the earliest for NEFRA would be like a second grade, third grade. You might have some first graders that could do it, but usually in first grade, you're still just trying to become fluent and really solidify that decoding. And you want to make sure that students are able to kind of read somewhat fluently by the time they get to do those NEFRA examples. I will say that if, when doing this digitally, or even in your classrooms, if you are reading the sentence out loud to them and it's part of a read aloud, you could do it anytime. You could definitely do that with first grade, still probably a little early for kindergarten, but you could definitely do that with younger students if you are the one reading aloud the sentence to them. That would definitely work. Great questions. How much time do I have? Okay, still have more time. What comprehension measure and assessment did you use to get these numbers? Great, so this is a question about our efficacy data. So the comprehension measure we used was our Amplify reading assessment, which is M-Class and Dibbles. And we did this in a large urban district that had a pretty significant number of English language learners as well. So we used that assessment to get those numbers. Would you say that Amplify reading program is more focused on developing comprehension skills versus decoding? Great question. I did not speak to this very clearly. The program is actually comprehensive, K through 5, all reading skills. So it includes very early decoding, letters, sound, correspondence, phonemic awareness, all the way up to 5th grade level close reading. So it has everything. The addition of comprehension processes is sort of what makes it an even more robust program compared to some of the other ones that we've seen out there, because we are the only program that has this focus on the comprehension processes. So we cover everything, and I'll speak a little bit more to that towards the end when I'm giving you all the details on how you can also get this for free. Is this program teacher-led or individual practice for kids online? Great question. It is for individual practice. So students should be able to do this program completely independently if they are home with their parents or wherever it is a completely like student on the computer one-on-one type of activity. We have seen some teachers use it, but it's not necessary for the program. And when I say we've seen teachers use it, like we've seen teachers use it as part of instruction, like using some of those examples for their own instruction. But that's definitely not necessary, and students are absolutely able to play it by themselves. Is this part of the CKLA program? Okay, so if you're familiar with Amplify, our elementary reading program is Core Knowledge Language Arts, also abbreviated as CKLA. It is not technically part of CKLA, but it is very closely aligned. So if you are a CKLA user and you use that curriculum, this is an excellent complement because it will follow the same sounds trajectory for the skills portion of CKLA, and there's lots of other knowledge connections throughout the program as well. So that's a great question. Okay, I will pause there to make sure, and let me get my screen back up here. Thank you for bearing with me. Oh, let's try that again. There we go. I am thrilled I've been thinking about this moment. I am thrilled that I feel like this is my Oprah moment where I get to say, you get Amplify reading and you get Amplify reading and everybody gets Amplify reading after I've been talking about it. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we understand that this is a really challenging time for schools and for teachers, incredibly stressful, so many things on your plate at the moment. And we are committed to supporting you and your students. And so we are happy to offer schools free access to a remote learning version of Amplify Reading for the remainder of the school year through June 30th. So as I mentioned, it is student driven. It is a digital resource. It works on a variety of devices, Chromebooks, iPads, desktops, laptops. You'll start to see demonstrated growth in just 30 to 45 minutes per week of usage. It is based on science of reading concepts. It includes these things like comprehension processes, and it is adaptive to student performance. So if students are moving really quickly in something, we will adapt them in that way. If they're struggling with a particular skill or content, we adapt to make sure that they're getting the right skills at the right time for them. It is founded in all game-based learning, as you can see from the examples that I gave. It is a really engaging and fun way for kids to learn how to read. And then the best part for all of you is that we also provide data insights for you to monitor their progress. So I know critically important now when you don't have students next to you every day, this will allow you to kind of just keep track of what they're doing and how they're progressing. So I'm really excited to be able to offer this. There's a link down there, amplify.com/amplify reading remote learning. And I believe that some of our moderators who are on the call with us will also be posting the link to this, I believe, in the chat, so that you can have access to this. And we'll also have a follow-up sent out to everyone who joined the presentation, so you can have all of this. So with that, I will close out. Thank you all so much. I really, again, it means so much to me to have you here on this Friday afternoon, taking time away from your very busy lives and what is your, very busy time trying to get your students all set up for being out of your classrooms. So thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Take care.